Okay, well, I think we can start. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. And welcome to today's lecture, Feminist Curating and Care, Possibilities and Limits by Helena Reckitt. The event is being recorded, as you can see, so please be mindful of what you want to share. And the recording will be made available on FEINART.org in the section Resources. The lecture is part of the public program of FEINART, which stands for the Future of European Independent Art Space in a Time of Socially Engaged Art. And the network includes 11 international researchers based in 4 universities: University of Wolverhampton, Zeppelin University, University of Iceland, and University of Edinburgh, as well as 7 partner organizations. The project is made possible with the support of Martinis Row grant, and you can find more details on the website feinart.org, including the recordings of the previous events and lectures and our blogs.
So we are Maria Makarticheva and Fabiola Piocco, and we are researchers in this project, and we are happy to be co-moderating this event together today, as our own research has been strongly informed by feminist curating, both in theory and in practice. Fabiola focuses on gender and the sexual division of labor in the curating and production of socially engaged art. And I'm studying the possibility of reciprocal relationship between institution and the audiences. So being in dialogue with Helena has been very fruitful and inspiring for us. As the FEINART network overall focuses on the theoretical and practical implications of socially engaged art, it has been crucial to collectively reflect on how institutions can serve as support structures for the relational way of working with, learning with, and caring with, as opposed to mastering. Helena has been creating collaborative institutional frameworks and reflecting on curatorial subjectivity in her practice. So we're looking forward to hear more of her thoughts on this today. Helena has worked as curator, public events programmer, educator, editor, and is currently reader in curating at Goldsmiths, University of London. With a long-standing interest in feminist and queer art, critical thought, and collective practice, she is editor of Art and Feminism from 2001 and consultant editor for the Art of Feminism, Images that Shaped the Fight for Equality from 2017. Since 2015, she coordinates the Feminist Duration Reading Group, a monthly meeting dedicated to feminisms outside the dominant canon. She also recently completed an MA in Creative and Life Writing and is exploring approaches from life writing in her critical and curatorial writing.
So before proceeding to the lecture, I just want to give you some last housekeeping reminders. We're going to start the presentation by Helena, which will last up to an hour, and then there will be an open discussion which will last for about 30 minutes. During the Q&A, questions can be asked by using the raise your hand Zoom button and to ask your question directly, or you can type the question in the chat box and we will read it out. And we also invite you all to join our informal get-together after the lecture, which is a space for further reflections, getting to know each other, or just chatting. And that will happen on a separate platform called Wonder. So please copy the link that Maria will now share in the chat box, as it will disappear after the Zoom event is finished. And now we're very happy to welcome Helena and to give her the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So thanks so much for inviting me and for that really nice introduction, very thoughtful and accurate in terms of what I'm going to try to do today. So my talk focuses on the kind of subjectivity demanded by curating in today's neoliberal art world. I draw on my own experiences to look at the kind of what I call the coping curatorial persona, a feminized figure who over-identifies with her work and her professional status. And I argue that this prevents her from engaging in more vulnerable, curious forms of curating with or learning with, akin to Joan Tronto's concept of caring with that was just referenced. So I'm interested in developing collaborative frameworks that become support structures that enable mutual exploration and discussion across and without suppressing differences, and that have the potential to forge reciprocal forms of coherence in the process of becoming public together. So as was noted, I did just finish an MA in creative and life writing. So I've been thinking about how to draw on personal experience and sort of native informer participation in the art field, which I've been involved in since my mid-20s, so more than 30 years, looking at different exhibition and curatorial programs, as well as educational, sort of radical educational activities, mainly in the UK, Canada, and the US, where I've worked, and also in parts of Europe. I also think through running an ongoing feminist reading group, developing public workshops around questions of care in the cultural sector. And now that I haven't been a full-time curator for about a decade, also reflecting on teaching, which I do at Goldsmiths in an MFA program in curating. So I would say I work in a mode of what Jane Gallup has called anecdotal theory. So I'm quite eclectic in what I draw upon. 1 minute it might be a work of feminist scholarship, the next it might be my own memories of working in a gallery, and the next it might be some Facebook discussions that I've had with friends and colleagues, where we kind of test out our ideas. So in 2016, 4 UK-based feminist curators and art historians published a roundtable discussion called Taking Care: Feminist Curatorial Pasts, Presents and Futures. Considering the critical scholarship belatedly devoted to feminist curatorial projects and perspectives, alongside the kind of effective labour required to develop socially engaged art projects, they reflected on the feminized traits of flexibility required to work in the contemporary art field. The ascendancy of the curator, as Kirsten Lloyd pointed out, can be framed as an economic symptom. Her rise beautifully, and I think that was maybe beautifully in quotes, beautifully aligning with the demand for entrepreneurship, precarity, networks and mobility associated with late capitalism. Particularly resonant for me as someone who'd worked in curatorial and programming roles in various non-profit contemporary art spaces in the UK, Canada and the US for over 20 years, were the comments of the English Stockholm-based curator Jenny Richards on the stereotype of the coping curator, who personifies arts workers' tendency to downplay systemic problems and mask personal emotions and the conditions under which they operate. She wrote that, that woman who looks great, perfect lipstick, never needs to sleep, and, as Ali Hochschild says, referring to her book, The Managed Heart, offering only the clean house, bracket gallery, and welcoming smile. But of course that figure doesn't exist, or she doesn't live in me. Instead, to meet the demand, one must split from self. Instead, to meet the demand, one must split from self, pushing the messy, difficult, as well as the desirable work into the background in order to leave a cleansed version of that role in public. Richard's characterization of emotional splitting and the emphasis on a clean and shiny facade of both the gallery and the curator who worked in it resonated with my experiences. Concerned to find private support for my exhibitions and programs as cuts to public arts funding made the institutions I worked for ever more reliant on private patronage, I realized that I'd invested a disproportionate amount of my time and energy cultivating relationships with the art collectors, financiers, lawyers, and property developers that populated the board of trustees of the gallery in my last full-time curatorial role in Toronto. I also cultivated relationships with the kind of sexy market-friendly artists that interested my board members and often filled their collections. With so much of my time spent networking, keeping up with the art world's itinerant calendar, and cultivating the kinds of friendships I mentioned, little time or energy remained for non-art world relationships or activities. I found myself in a double bind. although I'd been working in senior positions for over a decade, I was not well paid. And as we know, these jobs, they have a history of attracting people who didn't essentially need to be paid, almost as extensions of their ownership of high valued cultural artifacts. So I basically lived paycheck for paycheck. I knew that my abilities to get another job, as well as to attract the funds to develop strong projects in my current workplace, depended on working above and beyond the hours I was paid for. I also identified strongly with the institution that I worked for and the artists and audiences associated with it. Faced with reduced programme and institutional budgets in the wake of austerity measures, I carried out the socially reproductive labour of maintaining the institution's smooth operations and positive public image. Internalising the pressure to operate in an opportunistic and entrepreneurial way, I felt unable to demand better conditions. Realising that the conditions of working to such high degrees of productivity, last-minute deadlines and obsessive presenteeism, whether in the gallery or outside at sort of relevant professional events, I realised that this was detrimental to my own and my co-workers' mental and physical health, and attempted to build solidarity with my colleagues. I remember going around the office, knocking on the doors for the individual cubicles that led up from the main space where the junior admin staff worked, trying to persuade one co-worker after another to join me in confronting management to demand change. But my efforts failed, perhaps because of the shortage of good arts jobs in that city and the knowledge that a supply of equally, if not overqualified applicants would fill their place. My colleagues preferred to stay silent. Later on, I learned that some of the longer-term employees regarded me, a Brit with no history in the city or the country, who had come via what they considered a provincial third-tier southern US city of Atlanta, considered me something of an interloper, more of a rival than an ally. And if I had found a way to make my discomfort public, doing so would have identified me as a whiner, a snowflake, lacking the resilience to suck it up and perform under pressure as required. Just as my personal life and affects were being thoroughly instrumentalized, I remember the gallery's fundraisers' eyes lighting up when I mentioned that a distant cousin was married to the head of a major bank known for its cultural philanthropy. At the same time, I was criticized by management for being overly emotional at work. In a classic instance of the disciplining of self that Foucault wrote about, it appeared that the only feelings I was allowed to display were those that could be put to institutional use. Being seen to represent the gallery's vanguard image was also part of my work, or the work I was expected to perform. I remember when a highly qualified potential curator was rejected from the gallery following her job interview, when a senior staff member complained that she came to her interview with dirty fingernails. And preparing to visit Venice for the Biennale, I was told to set up meetings with influential curators and artists in high-profile venues, regardless if we had plans to work with them. It's all about the optics, my senior colleague told me. I've given this in-depth account of my identifications with curatorial work, not, I hope, to be self-indulgent, although the fact that I make that caveat reflects the prejudices against drawing on personal experience that still pervade critical discourse, but to understand my embodied experiences as reflections of broader socioeconomic conditions under late capitalism. The obligation to promote a personal or professional persona or brand, which I felt when I worked as an institutional curator, resembles what the Canadian scholar Laurent Fournier characterizes as selfie care. In the constant search for the dopamine pull of likes and engagement in our competitive attention economy, the cultivation of such a persona takes precedence over genuine forms of self and collective nurturance, she argues. We're all familiar with the social media feeds dominated by images of an individual attending high-profile arts events alongside glamorous luminaries. Fournier also pinpoints how this prestige association can operate in relation to fashionable theoretical texts, identifying how a succession of post-internet artists have depicted themselves posing alongside such voguish publications. Although, and here's an example that I've noticed. So there's Johanna Hedver, who styles herself in the imagery that accompanied her essay, Sick Woman Theory, where it says art direction Johanna Hedver. And I don't think we can see it here, but the books that her feet are resting on are kind of, I think, predominantly kind of queer and crip theory. I will say that Lauren Fournier, although she points out this phenomenon of kind of glamour by association with voguish theory, she's actually much more sympathetic in the case of people like Hedver, where she recognizes that the texts that they tend to place along themselves, photograph themselves with, are presented as weapons in the struggle for psychic and physical survival. So texts that engage with biopolitics, the medicalization of bodies, and so on. Of the feminized nature of my over-identification with work and its sacrificial aspects, numerous feminists have investigated the link between the exploitation of emotional and caring labor by women and feminized subjects who are passionate about their work, and the invisibilized and unpaid housework that they carry out in society broadly as well as in the art field. From Prison Guard to Healer, curatorial authorships in the context of gendered economies, which is just coming out in an English translation. It was previously published in German. Nana Berman characterizes the tendency of curators to over-identify with institutions they work for and stay silent about their criticisms of them as Stockholm Syndrome. Elsewhere, Isabel Graw has discussed the muting of critical voices in the context of networked mobile working conditions, each cultural worker dependent on maintaining positive relations with former and potential collaborators or bosses as forms of weak links in the reputational economy. In this essay, Berman traces the feminization of curatorial work, developing arguments that link to Brian Holmes's concept of the flexible personality required by late capitalism, and echoed by the comments of Kirsten Lloyd on the economic ascendancy of the curator that I quoted earlier. Noting women's dominance in the curatorial, if not yet the directorial field of art, Berman remarks how complementary to stereotypical associations of artistry with masculinity, structural analogies can be discerned between traditional scripts of femininity and widespread curatorial codes of conduct. Beyond the shared etymology of care work and curating in the Latin curare, to care, the practices of curators and care workers are generally associated with an emphasis on modesty, restraint, and a negation of productivity or creativity of authorship. She goes on, moreover, their subject position have in common an emancipatory trajectory from invisible agents' stagehands behind the scenes of representational economies to the role of protagonists that take center stage. Berman asks, against this background, one may wonder to what extent the white cube, which Caroline Christophe-Bacagiev called a space of emancipation in the context of Documenta 13, might be understood as a neoliberal smooth space in which the benevolent curatorial smile conveys the impression of freedom from domination through the use of barely noticeable soft power. So once I'd stopped working as a full-time institutional curator and started teaching at Goldsmiths about a decade ago, I began to disentangle my investments in the performance of professionalism, trend consciousness, and networked relationality in the art world. I wrote several texts, including one with Jenny Richards. Oh, that's just a reference to the Brian Holmes flexible personality, including a text with Jenny Richard, who's the one whose concept of the Coping Curator I began with, and also Danielle Child, where we performed a kind of group consciousness raising, where we tried to think through all the ways in which we prioritized our work as arts workers and academics over other parts of our lives. I also led several workshops around the notion of what I called unlearning habits of care, trying to think through where care was placed, what was valued, and indeed what was valorized economically, particularly within the art world. In many ways, I feel that this was similar to the consciousness raising that 70s feminists developed, identifying problems that felt personal, but which reflected wider systems of wider systemic problems and value systems. My efforts, and such as the insights that came out of the workshops, backed up the recognition of Lena Dujarovic and Irene Ravel, formerly of the curatorial group Electra, that cultural workers act as canaries in the coal mine, registering toxic working conditions on a somatic level before the situation is acknowledged broadly. This is just from one of the workshops I organised. Michel Foucault, of course, described this kind of self-examination as parrhesia, speaking truth to power in ways that are necessarily self-critical, self-exposing, and that lay the ground for potentially changing ingrained and naturalized habits. In her writing on Foucault, Liz Kinnamon distinguishes between a critical care for the self and the solipsistic approaches to self-care endemic to neoliberalism. She challenges the dismissal of critical self-care work by political radicals who she believes too easily write off such practices as self-indulgent, individualistic, and consumer-oriented. She argues for some critics, capitalism's instrumentalization of personal responsibility becomes grounds for a paranoid reflex against care of the self, if not the staging of a total refusal to take oneself as object of one's attention. What may result is self-neglect or an overestimation of collectivity, as if liberation and joy result from the act of mere togetherness. Discussing Foucault's writing on Greco-Roman asceticism in care of the self, she highlights his interest in philosophy that insisted one should attend to oneself, transform oneself, turn and return to oneself, and spend your whole life learning how to live. Attending to the self was an art of existence and crucially a labor, she writes. It takes time, entailing reflection, introspection, and contemplation. She draws out the role of mentorship, teaching, ethical relations, and social transformation that distinguish care of the self as a social practice. So in a modest but sustained way, I've tried to adopt some of these forms of care of the self and related practices of mentorship and ethical friendship within a reading group that I set up 6 years ago, which meets each month to look at feminism primarily outside the Anglo-American canon. The collective care that it attempts to carry out finds resonance with Foucault's attention to relationships of mentorship, rather than seek to initiate younger or newer friends to feminism into the cultural field in an unquestioning or critical way. We do so with a desire to encourage feminist alliances and kinships that can make a difference and enact alternative to the conservative systems we've inherited. The impetus behind the Feminist Duration Reading Group grew from a desire to learn about Italian feminisms, a body of collective practice about which I was almost completely ignorant, but once I learned about, I craved to know more. A lecture by Fulvia Carnevale of the ready-made artist collective Clairefontaine had alerted me to this rich yet underknown, certainly in body of work, including some translations that she'd recently published. I was especially intrigued by the collective practices that Fulvia described of strategic withdrawal and refusal, such as in the feminist practice of the feminist leader and former art critic Carla Lanzi, the nudity that Italian women experienced being in unguarded feminist environments, and the deep culture of relational politics that various Italian feminist collectives developed. I called a meeting together over at Goldsmiths, unsure of who would come or what would emerge. It felt as if these texts were belatedly entering the feminist circles I moved in, and thus had the undetonated potential of the past the literary scholar Elizabeth Freeman refers to in her work on temporal drag. I did not know where the process would lead, but was driven by the curiosity of the group and the desire of participants to follow the lines of practice that emerge, akin to how desire lines emerge across shared space. I'll just show you a few images from some of our sessions. One of the things that the Feminist Curation Reading Group quickly developed was a practice of reading out loud, one paragraph, one person at a time. Reading together, we become intimately familiar with texts which have often been marginalised and unvalued. At the same time, we get to know other members of the group, appreciating the different timbres of voice, accents, and the cultural and regional experience they reflect, along with the insights that participants bring. Reading together, I often find, brings out nuances and insights that I missed when I previously read alone. Befriending other and earlier periods of feminism and placing them in dialogue with current urgencies, the group offers a support structure for the exploration of dominant feminisms. We often say that we start from the position of ignorance, recognizing the limits of our knowledge, its reliance on what's available and dominant and translated, as we enter a process of collective exploration. The effort we make to stay with the text, to focus on what's before us and in common, helps to create a sense of intimacy. Working in this way, in this sort of unguarded way, is a relief from my main livelihood as a lecturer. At the same time, I think it's enlivened my institutional teaching, as I see the classroom as a structure for reciprocal learning. I also get to access institutional resources like spaces, libraries, photocopies and scanners, so I can share some of those resources outside its boundaries. Instead of teaching feminisms under known archives as the objects of purely academic study, we regard them as tools to learn from in the present. We also ask challenging questions that place these feminist projects and writers under scrutiny and calls them to account. As in a session we held earlier this year with Kyla Wazana Tompkins, which considered how anger has operated as a force in feminist thought and politics, from second wave feminists' rage at the ingrained sexism they faced, to contemporary intersectional feminists who berate the biases and exclusions of their feminist forebears. While acknowledging second wave feminism's many absences, suppressions, and prejudices, Tompkins urges us not to dismiss this history outright. She argues that the women's liberation movement built the foundations for feminist and queer possibilities and futures, even if many of them remain unmet, and asks, is it possible to hold all these things at the same time? Before COVID, we'd started to alternate our meetings in public art galleries, 1 month with those in private homes across different neighbourhoods the next. And we found that these longer sessions where we cooked, ate and drank as well as read together, very sustaining. During COVID, we took the group online and were really able to maintain, I think, quite special, intimate and unguarded readings and discussions through our Zooms. One participant who joined the group during lockdown remarked how much she appreciated that we seemed to put as much value on the atmosphere as our meetings as we did on the texts we selected. But I would say now we are probably experiencing Zoom fatigue, and we're looking forward to holding sessions, if not back indoors, then outside. We've got a sort of eco-feminist strand developing, where we're also looking at feminist architectural practices like those of the Matrix Collective. So we're going to be holding some sessions in gardens and community spaces that they designed. In anticipation of being together after a year and a half apart, last month we invited the artist Galit Crichton to help us reacquaint ourselves with the idea of togetherness. She led 2 sessions, the first online, which included things like blocking our eyes, and then being put into breakout rooms where we just looked at each other and refamiliarized each other with familiarized ourselves with one another's kind of physical presence. And then in a second session, we gathered in a seminar room and did various very slow exercises to do with looking, being in space together, watching each other without smiling, which the person who was tasked with doing that with me, said that I looked very sad and she wanted to take care of me. Just back to that question of working outside, I think I'm seeing a lot of curatorial and art projects by friends and collaborators, which are, I guess, looking outside the gallery. It's not a new thing, but I think with COVID, with lockdown, and also with a sense of exhaustion that we're experiencing, the appeal of events based around food, cooking, gardening. I've got a number of friends who sort of moved from being curators to gardeners. It seems to be a trend. And in fact, the session after this with Zeppelin University and Raju Rage is looking at food and cooking as forms of kind of sustenance and cultural heritage. I'm not quite sure how that's going to go, because obviously that's at 7 o'clock tonight. So one of the artists that has worked with the Feminist Duration group, she was part of an events program that members of the group organised in 2015. At the end of our first year of meeting, we organised a program called Now You Can Go, which looked at legacies of Italian feminism and their kind of current relevance, is the artist Alex Martinis Row. And she's worked with structures of affidamento or entrustment inspired by those developed by the Milan Women's Bookshop Collective that was established in the early 70s and that's still going as a bookshop, publisher and meeting space today. Affidamento is based on the belief that differences between members of a group can be a source of strength rather than something to be suppressed in the search for consensus. And this was an insight that members of the Milan Women's Bookshop Collective reached after they had moved from meeting in small private spaces to getting their own building, and realizing that in this less intimate environment, certain of the more kind of confident, dominant women tended to prevail in their discussions, and other women became very passive. And they realized that one of the problems was that they had suppressed desire and curiosity through going in a more public, working in a more public way. So, and that they wanted to recognize the differences, including disparities between women, slightly controversial. But I think what I find really interesting about the way Alex Martinis Row works is that she performs affidamento with her collaborators. So for this film, to become, what was it, to become two? Yes. Oh, no, Our Future Network. So for this film, Our Future Network, Alex invited 22 women. There were non-women invited, but in the end, only women came to attend a 3-day workshop outside Berlin, where each of us brought a feminist proposition, which we workshopped in advance with Alex, as she formed a kind of mediating figure of affidamento with each individual. Then we took it to the workshop, discussed and explored it with the others, and then she filmed as we kind of tried out, tested, and sometimes argued with the propositions that emerged. This one I particularly like around public speaking, and this stems from the emphasis on public speaking that Alex and a collective she ran in Berlin developed. So every time one of them was asked to give us a talk, they were mainly artists, designers, that kind of thing, another of the group would go and very honestly report on their performance, not really the content of what they'd said, but how they were performing themselves in public. So acting as figures of affidamento to help develop an area of their lives that many members of the collective, the women in the collective, found difficult. There's a proposition that came out of that workshop, which actually stemmed from some of the participants feeling that there wasn't enough time, there wasn't enough space felt left for those who couldn't work in such a kind of fast and streamlined way as Alex needed us to over the course of 3 days, resulting in an hour-long film. And I like the flexibility of her approach. So she learned from the criticism that was voiced in the workshop, and then in her book, To Become Two, one of these indeed reflects on how to create, what does it say, taking time and taking care. And Alex identifies the importance of commitment to working across differences as kind of key to kind of collective projects. She says, and I've got the quote up here, Commitment is one of the most important factors in generating the kind of feminist group dynamics that safe space discourse is concerned with. This is in a conversation where I raised the issue of safe space and also raised some of the complexities in the workshop that I'd attended with her. So she says, rather than saying, I'm not going to say this, I'm not going to say that, and go silent because you're worried you might say the wrong thing, I think it would be better to just be committed to the group and the project. Thinking instead, I'm not going to leave when it gets difficult, or I'm not going to abandon something if I've made a mistake and hurt them, rather than constantly trying to prevent yourself from making mistakes. So I guess there's a kind of that is probably more important for making safer spaces than self-policing. Another discussion of affidamento and kind of the complexities of difference that I just came across is in reference to her book, My Brilliant Friends, by the literary scholar Nancy K. Miller. Book came out 2 years ago. She wrote, and it's a memoir of her friendship with 3 other feminist academics in the US, which draws on structures of affidamento. And Miller foregrounds the concept of Klein for friendships based in reciprocity rather than mutual mirroring. She says there has to be room for movement between pronouns, between, say, I and you. Translated into emotions, this would mean finding the right space between difference and sameness, keeping difficulty alive without erasing pleasure. Miller objects to the pervasive idea inherited from Aristotle that the important friend is a kind of second self. She's not the same as you, she says. She's someone enough like you for there to be attraction, but there's also a distance, the Klein idea. In fact, too much sameness can be fatal to a relationship and obviously by extension a political project. Miller's insights into Klein find resonance with the philosopher Adriana Cavarero's discussion of feminist collective practices of reciprocal narration, such as the relationship between Amelia and Amalia that she writes about in her book, Relating Narratives. The 2 women gained political consciousness during the Italian feminist movement of the 70s when they took part in the 150 hours trade union schools that became a fertile site for feminist pedagogy, particularly with people like Lea Melandri. While both Amelia and Amalia had completed their formal education before high school, one of them, Amalia, possessed a talent for speaking and writing, whereas the other, similarly named Amelia, found it hard to express herself in words. While she constantly attempted to tell the story of her life, which in her view has always been a no, her fragmentary efforts prove unsatisfactory to her, as well as tedious to her fellow students. Finally, her friend Amalia writes down the story of her life. This act provokes Amelia to tears. Carrying around the account in her handbag, she constantly rereads it, moved every time by her identity, made tangible by the tale. Oh, I think I've got this in a quote. Oh, no, I don't. As Cavarero describes it. Cavarero uses this example of feminist friendship to highlight the importance of narration to political consciousness, what she calls the process of reciprocal co-appearance. Characterizing Amelia's act of life writing as a gift constituted in relation, Cavarero writes how the story allows Amelia to move beyond the limiting what of her identity, a Milanese housewife, poor, married, childless, to the who of her existence, an unrepeatable uniqueness, which, in order to appear to others, needs first of all a plural and therefore political space of interaction. It's a commitment to stay with the trouble that Martinis Row emphasized, in which difference and disagreements within a project or a group are not suppressed, but can be a part of its strength if approached within a framework of long-term engagement. And it very much resonates with the 5th category that Joan Tronto identified as a moral category for caring: plurality, communication, trust and respect, solidarity, caring with. Being part of an unfolding group project like the Feminist Duration Reading Group has led me to develop a theory of the curious curator, a contrast to the Coping Curator evoked by Jenny Richards. swishing around the pristine white cube gallery with her perfect lipstick haircut, maybe dressed in COS or some designer outfit picked up from an outlet store, or maybe found on Etsy, who suppresses her real feelings about the conditions under which she works. The curious curator puts elements into play, unsure of the results, open to contingency, as well as antagonism and its attendant feelings of anxiety. Rather than performing mastery, she works from a position of ignorance and active desire, recognizing that I don't get it or I want to know more can be useful ways of initiating mutual discovery. To borrow the title of an article by the writer I quoted earlier, Kyla Wazana-Tompkins, we aren't here to learn what we already know. Or as Natalie Lovelace writes in her recent book, Research Creation at the End of the World, you can't be curious about something you already know, but you need to know something about it in order to be curious. She uses curiosity as a driving force throughout her book, saying, etymologically, curious has the same roots as careful or curate, to care. She points out it brings warning, caution, desire to know, and considered choice, the care at stake in curation, together as the name of the pedagogical game. Such a perspective challenges pedagogical ideologies that imagine the teacher in the light of knowledge and the student in the shadows of ignorance, and instead tells stories that are much riskier for all involved, but more accurate, to my experience of the world at least, and more interesting. A central function of what she terms research creation is to mark the practice of thinking with as a multiple and productively discordant one, in which partnerships, disciplines, forms at stake are always already uncannily in question. It thus works as a potent intervention into university norms in ways that act as polydisciplinary or polydiscipline amorous. Amateurism and curiosity meet desire, resonating with Anna Collins' curatorial approaches in Witches, Hunted, Appropriated, Empowered, Queered, which, without meaning to invalidate the author's competencies, claims some measure of amateurism. The term amateur is understood in the sense used by the artist and writer Claire Pentecost, whose manifesto on the researcher artist uses the expression public amateur to designate those who serve as a conduit between specialized knowledge fields and other members of the public sphere. Eric Rogoff, who teaches at Goldsmiths, although in a different bit to me, critical of the language of metrics and outputs, disciplinary boundary management in academic and cultural institutions, proposes the notion of becoming research. Developed with others as part of the European Forum for Advanced Practices, she suggests that becoming research expands beyond those within privileged scholarly institutions and is seen as a matter of necessity. For example, for migrants to survive, for those transitioning gender to understand what they're facing, biologically, legally, and civically, for those who fight for justice and those who simply want to do no harm, for those who develop an understanding that knowledge as spectacle, as revenue, as branding, even when it is about harm, actually does harm. Becoming research, Rogoff says, shifts from working from inherited knowledges to working with conditions. These conditions, she says, become the drive, not the subject matter of the work, and research transforms from an investigative impulse to the constitution of new realities. It is thus, she argues, that we recognize research not as an elevated activity requiring a great deal of knowledge, nor simply the urge to find things out, but the stuff of everyday life. She says every form of hardship encountered, whether one is an immigrant or living out catastrophic conditions, afflicted by emotional sea changes or crises of identity or of security, generates research, and everyone researches. At the center of these processes of caring and curious research, learning, and curating is a recognition of the need to slow down. One of the unlearning habits of care exercises that I carried out which was prompted by my realization of how uncared for many of us working in the cultural sector feel, asked participants to recall a time when they'd either felt cared or uncared for in the art world. Perhaps unsurprisingly, almost everyone who took part shared their experience of being profoundly uncared for, provoking an almost overwhelming outpouring of collective sadness. Actually, most people were in tears. I won't say an entirely successful exercise. And it certainly left my goal of identifying some of the qualities and textures that being cared for provokes unmet. Following this interesting, albeit somewhat failed exercise, I've tried to notice the times I myself have felt cared for. And I realized that a key characteristic is feeling worthy of attention, physical, emotional, political. And I've been trying to put my fingers on a simple exercise I read about conducted by a child psychologist, where a child who was experiencing a lot of problems with its very indulgent in terms of constantly giving them gifts and special food, but the child was really struggling with its relationship with its parents. And the exercise the child psychologist carried out was to ask the child to make a drawing and then to very, very carefully describe back to them what they had drawn. And this was a real breakthrough. It gave the child a sense of value that they had not been getting by being given all these consumables. So the example of Amelia and Amalia that I mentioned earlier comes again to mind. Amalia's care for her friend, reflected in taking time to understand, listen to, and shape her life narrative, enables Amelia to move beyond the limiting and stereotypical what of her identity to the who of her unrepeatably unique existence, an appearance which, you recall, in order to appear to others, needs a plural and therefore political space for interaction. The call to slow down cultural production, take care and take time, was voiced 4 years ago by the curator Natasha PetrovaBachelet in her text for Slow Institutions, drawing on Isabel Stenger's concept of slow science in her book Catastrophic Times, where paying attention is entailed in more than human entanglements, and research institutions and researchers learn to be affected and to affect the creation of the future. Proposing that art institutions develop a more holistic approach to the resources they comprise, from the human to the architectural and the infrastructural, PetrovaBachelet sought to challenge the heightened pace of cultural production associated with the event economy, cultural tourism, biennialization on the one hand, and austerity measures, overproduction, and the professionalization of art academies on the other. As in the examples I mentioned earlier, where attention is paid to the life cycles of gardening, growing, and cooking, she argues, what sustains those moments when someone is mesmerized and forever transformed by understanding the perspective of someone else, when transformative power comes from participants thinking together, is more similar to the slow knowledge of a gardener than the fast one of so-called rational industrial agriculture. What's my next? Oh, just checking. Oh yeah, here we go. So I've often wished that I could articulate the importance of slowing down and paying attention when I've interviewed for various curatorial and programming jobs, who always ask you to come up with years worth of advanced, detailed plans as if you knew exactly what was needed before you'd even got the job. Whereas, as we know, it generally takes at least a year of kind of paying attention, listening to your colleagues, and observing, local urgencies and context before you have any clue as to what's really needed. I was therefore really pleased not long ago in 2019 when Cecilia Weedham took over directorship of Tänzer Kunsthall from Maria Lind in Stockholm, and she acknowledged Maria's important work, expressing her wish to build upon it rather than archive and deem it obsolete, refusing to play the Oedipal game of succession and overflow, slowing down, paying attention and giving value where it's been systematically denied. Such approach to curating is, if anything, inflexible compared to the overly flexible curator described by Jenny Richards, whose example of impenetrable perfection only perpetuates the idea that curatorial care, like physical resources, is an inexhaustible resource to be exploited. In place of this one-side sacrificial stance, the curious curator attempts to form relationships of reciprocity, affection, and mutuality, befriending issues as well as people, books as well as artworks, and humans in ways that Celine Condorelli has likened to the working in friendship. Contrasting the overly flexible curator and instrument of soft power identified by Nana Berman and Jenny Richards. Oh, here's just a little bit more. I kind of used this press release of Cecilia taking the new role to have a bit of a Facebook chat with various friends who also noted how ridiculous it was that they were expected to know what they were going to do before they got a job, and examples of institutions not giving them a job but then running with their ideas anyway. I really like what this person, Taru Elfving, says. Yes, thinking of Haraway's composting metaphor and the feminist collective politics this calls for. And Susan Kelly, who's a great militant activist at Goldsmiths. Yes, imagine if uni bosses did the same. Vision usually equals disrespect and destruction. That's why we're on strike at Goldsmiths right now.
Are you still with us, Helena? We've just lost the sound for a moment. If you do, just bear with us whilst we do get the speaker back. I think we just have lost the audio. I'm just going to pause the recording for a moment whilst we get the speaker back.
Okay, so Pascal Gielan proposes the figure of the inflexible curator, who he equates with carrying out acts of love and care. The truly loving curator, he says, would not exhibit an artist on the basis of a predetermined category, such as national identity. Who, for example, would want to receive a declaration of love due to his or her nationality being Moroccan, Turkish, Chinese, or whatever, and who wishes to receive a declaration of love for just a short-term finite project? He writes, both the politics of cultural representation, which operates for artists in all sorts of global art events, and the policy of diversity towards target groups or potential audiences lack a genuine love for others and for the other. This loving curator would sustain their commitment to an artist or values over the long term, thus risking becoming outmoded as they age along with the artists and practices they support. Curiosity, from Gielan's perspective, does not mean frantically keeping up with the latest trends, but staying true to what happens when engagement, relationships, and conversations and processes deepen and develop over time. In the few minutes I have left, I'm just going to show two, I think, really great case studies that embody many of the things that I'm interested in. The first one is it's actually 11 years old. It's actually 11 years old now. It's from, how do I move down? It's from Casco in Utrecht, and it was called the Grand Domestic Revolution. And it started as a series of residencies by artists, architects, designers, as well as writers and theorists in an apartment near the gallery in a tract. And then it took on different forms, responding to local contexts and urgencies in London, in Derry, Londonderry, Ljubljana, Stockholm, and Malmo. I think in each case with a feminist or female director or curator. Informed by institutional consciousness raising, where ingrained habits regarding what forms of work and productivity were valued and what disavowed and taken for granted, the programme put the invisible and domestic labour of social reproduction, of building and sustaining life at its core. It explored how such work could at once be given more recognition and value, as well as how it might be collectivised or abolished altogether. A form of living research where cohabitation becomes a methodology practiced in and around the home. The programme stimulated explorations into conditions of hosting and cohabitation, starting with the residency that I mentioned. The decision to organise an exhibition with elements that had been developed in the somewhat private space of the apartment, as well as collaborations with various groups across the city, was taken some way into the process as a way for participants to find a form to present themselves to a public and to become public in the process across their alliances as well as their differences. Questions of cohabitation played out in the extensive networks that the programme fostered, including with various individual and collectives of artists, designers, architects, gardeners, squatters groups, and a trades union of domestic workers. The programme also encompassed the time needed to spend time together to cook and eat, building seminars, archives, and libraries, and in other ways caring about and for each other and the values central to the programme. Characterising the feeling states or the modes of operation as intimate, intersubjective, spontaneous, and unstructured. The initiating curator, Bina Choi, noted that instead of following a social service model, I'll just get her quote, a social service model wherein a service is provided by one group for another, our interest was to form horizontal and mutual relationships with heterogeneous communities. We still sought alignment with social movements, but in more tangential ways. It's as tangents that these works do not serve the objectives of those moments in a straightforward fashion. They rather seek possibilities for typically impossible communities to be formed, with the hope of stimulating each movement to open itself up to fully becoming what it is. She writes, alignment is not the end goal. The deeper pursuit is of a practice that is in itself a form of society, originally involved by those often passed over initiatives and ideas. And the final example I'll mention, which I think is quite interesting because it's from a very large and wealthy institution. So most of the examples I've given so far are a kind of artist or curator initiative, quite modest, or from nimble research-based arts institutions like Casco. But the Wellcome Collection in London is going through a really interesting moment where a number of programmers, but also sort of administrators with a commitment to social justice are in leadership roles. So they recently announced a £1 million commitment to an anti-Blackness and racism, access and inclusion and diversity strategy. And they've really been thinking about how to really build reciprocity into their exhibitions. So Being Human, installed in 2019, shows the impact of slowed down processes of research and consultation on design and curatorial decision making. The exhibition takes its cue from the social model of disability, which holds that a person isn't disabled because of their impairment, health condition, or the ways in which they may differ from the norms, the medical norms, but because of physical and attitudinal social barriers, prejudice, lack of access adjustments, and systemic exclusion. It was designed as a permanent rather than a temporary exhibition. And this too reflected their staff's realization that temporary displays focused on specific social issues or identity groups fall short if the implications within their programs are not reflected on broader institutional levels. As the curator of Being Human argues, if the exhibition embraces difference, but the permanent hang reinforces prejudice, visitors may leave with no greater sense of being valued by the museum than when they arrived. More insidiously, the affirmation of diversity in temporary programs can go as far as reinforcing ghettoization. So they incorporated insights from long-term consultations that they undertook with disabled individuals and members of organizations, as well as academics and research scientists. As a result, they adapted the gallery floor plan to accommodate visitors who would be viewing work from a wheelchair or standing, installed plenty of seating, and designed the gallery entrance for wheelchair users in a prominent place so that wheelchair users didn't have to enter by the back door as they usually did. Welcome employees were invited to lend their own prosthetics to the exhibition. When displayed, these objects, which include a pair of glasses, a hearing aid, and a prosthetic knee and a breast, were accompanied by their owners' accounts of their mixed emotions about them, thus challenging the gap between perceived disabled and non-disabled subjects and the people in the institution and the broader public. I think I'm at the end of my time. I'm just going to conclude with a final reference to a project. What I have a couple of pages talking about, which I don't have time for, is that I didn't want to overestimate the autonomy of individual curators, as I think was quite clear from my account of trying to build solidarity in a workplace where that wasn't easy to find. Institutional change, does need to be enacted on a much broader level. And I have a very nice quote from Kate Barclay, who's just written a book called Academic Emotion, Feeling the Institution, where she says to change the emotional culture of a vocational environment such as the art world is significantly more challenging than tweaking the disorders of an out of sync group of employees. It requires a commitment by the institution and its members to become something different. And I have a little bit in the talk where I talk about cooling off, which is how she describes many academics are feeling as they come to terms with the inhospitable environment of today's academic world. On the one hand, demanding loyalty and passion and care, but then not really caring for those who work for it. And a similar thing is happening in the art world. Many people are cooling off and attempting to distance or disidentify from the kind of expectations of the Coping Curator that I've described. But one of the kind of compensations for the, I think, increasingly ambivalent feelings of academics that Kate Barclay identifies are those moments of joy in teaching where your students become your teachers. And that's certainly something that I've experienced. So I just want to end with a project that is developed by a former student of mine called Lucy Lopez in collaboration with Alba Colomo. It's called La Sala, and it's an emerging intersectional feminist space in Nottingham in England. Envisaging an arts organisation built around the table and in relation to their allotment and the food it produces, they aim to be generative rather than extractive. So for this event series, Fermenting Institutions, Thinking Beans, they adopted fermenting as a methodology that sheds light on slow organic processes akin to developing an organisation which is generative, sensitive to locality, and responsive to conditions of burnout, both planetary and personal. So initiatives like La Sala attempt to make art worlds that more closely resemble the ones that the initiators want to inhabit instead of those they inherited, rather than succumbing to the demand that they surrender all their vitality, creativity, and devotion to institutions that simultaneously suck the very life out of them. They commit to working in ways that are sustainable to the planet as well as their own bodies in non-stressful environments that aim to nurture pleasure and joy. And I'll end with these lovely words. And then my final page is my references, quite small, but there they are for those of you who want to do further reading around this. So I'm very happy to take any questions or comments. Don't have to be questions, can just be observations or things that you're getting from this or not.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helena. Yeah, so we're open to questions and comments. And in order to question or comment, please either press the raise your hand button or type the question in the chat and we can read it for you. Okay, so I can see there is a first question from Demetra. Would you, please go ahead.
Hi, Demetra. Nice to see you.
Hello, Helena. It's so lovely to see you. And I want to thank you so much for extending the invitation to join the lecture when you did today. And it's only because of another COVID restriction that I'm working from home and I'm able to participate. I just want to say thank you so much for these thoughts. They're very much the thoughts working inside or outside the institution. I received all of your ideas with great care, but I did laugh out loud when you used the term Stockholm syndrome, because that's pretty much, it does feel like that a lot. You're coming now more from the situation of working in the academy in terms of knowledge transfer or generation between generations of artists and curators. In work in a very small organization now, 240 miles north of Toronto, and I am very much aware that, you know, the collections such as they are, one must have curators from the community come in and have access and work with those collections and then find their usefulness for them, such as they are. So I just wanted to say that those ideas that you're bringing, I worked in the same institution. I had the visual image of you going around I'm sorry about that circumstance, knocking on those doors. I once worked in one of those doors, behind one of those doors. I just want to say I'm going to take these thoughts into consideration, working with a very young team who have, through COVID, now had to become much more empowered in terms of the operation of the organization, the institution, and the opportunity to curate and present programming of their own, a very non-academic place.
Right, is this the kitchen? No, where are you now, Demetra?
I'm in Sudbury.
Sudbury, yeah.
Yeah, Sudbury is about 240 miles north.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to offer that we don't have an academic basis here in Sudbury. The university doesn't have a visual art program and has just gone through a period of cataclysmic downsizing due to fiscal restraint. But we also have two other post-secondary institutions, and the advantage of having those post-secondary institutions is that our community, which is pretty much fixed, French, English, and Indigenous, has become incredibly diverse from students who have come up to these institutions from Greater Toronto. So Sudbury is much more diverse on the street than it was even 10 years ago, which is really exciting. That's too much to say. I just wanted to respond to that and say that I am very interested in questions of morality in terms of the institutional transfer of practice and knowledge from my generation, I'm 62, to people who are 26 or 27 and have got their MAs, but are in a regional center such as this.
And I'd also say it's not just the ones who've got their MAs or their PhDs, because I think one of the things that I've been really thinking through with, you know, friends who are still working in galleries is, in a way, how the elitism of only looking to hire people who've been through these institutions, especially, I can't remember what the fee situation is like in Canada, but, you know, in the UK, the student fees are really high now. So for a lot of working class people, you know, it's such a gamble to go to university. It's such a gamble to do an MA, even do a BA. So, for example, East Side Projects in Birmingham, I don't know that organisation super well, but last time I was there, they were talking about really interrogating their hiring practices and trying to, instead of like look at the CV and say, oh, that person, you know, went to Goldsmiths or that person went to York University, say this person has done something really interesting on the ground. This person has been active locally. What are they, you know, and also what can we learn for them, which we won't learn if we just go to somebody who looks like us, who's kind of echoes our professional background or artistic background.
Thank you for those thoughts. We will be obviously hiring in my position. You know, I have another 3 years. I am planning on moving away from this role and when I'm 65, but those ideas, trying to bring them through the board and have the board be prepared to hire with a more open mind without, as you know, coming into the institution, it's dreadfully hard.
It's dreadfully hard. And the boards, you know, that's a huge area of education, especially where the boards are very influential, but actually aren't around very much. And they, you know, so yeah, we could talk all night about some of these issues. Cecilia, I see, is on this call. Oh, that's nice. I think I've pronounced your name wrong, Cecilia.
Okay, thank you very much, Demetra, for your comments. And now I will pass on to Karen.
Thank you so much, Helena, for this really dense and rich talk and this amazing reading list you gave to us. I really appreciate that. I've got a more general question, because I always ask myself what happens to this very intimate situation, like cooking together, having this reading group together, if you take photographs of it as if it was an exhibition, as if it was a kind of public thing that happens there. The question that relates to that is that I found it really interesting, or I find it really interesting, that it seems to me as if there is a very specific sphere that is built there, which is not only an intimate, so-called safe space, but something that then mirrors back to a public sphere. And I would be happy if you would elaborate a little bit on that, because if we use the term curating, we usually think of producing a kind of public things that has a specific function within the society, and all this setup to me seems to be different in your cases.
Oh my goodness, I'm not quite sure how to come in on that. I mean, I suppose in a way it's got links to forms of curating which are not about obviously objects and necessarily spectacle, although you're right, there is this thing of when you turn it into a spectacle by taking a photograph of people reading or eating a curry together. And there's a little bit of me that's a bit ambivalent about that, but it's also a recruitment drive, right? It's also to try and attract other people who might not come if they didn't have some kind of visual representation. And maybe it's also a way of the group seeing itself as a group, or people, it's not, you know, and it's a very open group, it's very porous, it's not the same people all the time. The question of whether it's public or not, it's very linked to, I guess, sort of pedagogy, and you could say is education public. I mean, these events are open to anybody who wants to come, and they are publicized, then there's no barrier, but it does tend to be somewhat of a network. So it is linked by, you know, affinities and friendships, but also friendships form. So people who don't have any prior association with the group will often, I think, become friendly through the process of reading together and learning together. And that's almost a kind of mediating way of feeling more friendly and befriended. It's also possibly a very English thing. The English are very keen on mediating activities like I have a dog, and that's a great way of meeting English people who you would never normally meet. Another great mediator is alcohol. You know, the English are very known for being much more relaxed after one or two. So I would say in some ways, the reading becomes a mediation and a way of creating environments where we can just be with people we don't know, but who share a desire to learn from feminism and put feminisms into practice in various ways. I think I've probably not answered your question, Karen, but do you want to follow up?
I think I'm satisfied with your answer, because I think it's a very big question. It's just an observation also that I think that is interesting, because in the realm of socially engaged art, we always have this photographs of people sitting together and talking with each other, and then again displaying these photographs. And I think it's an interesting thing that happens there, and maybe we have to elaborate or consider it a little bit more in depth.
Yeah. And I've been a bit resistant to record our sessions. And sometimes I get a lot of people saying, please record it. I really want to see it. But I'm like, well, it's not really about something to watch. No, it really is about the process of actually feeling unguarded and able to stumble over your words as you're reading, or ask a question that reveals that you know absolutely nothing about, you know, South Korea, but that's okay. So we occasionally record them, but for the most part we don't, although we have done things like, you know, writing reports or putting stuff in the readings on the website so other people can access them. Sorry, there's another question.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like how this formal lecture and Q&A is actually turned into a really nice, friendly discussion. And so, although it's been recorded and moderated, so I hope that's like a really nice, like the atmosphere. So I'll pass the next question to Fabiola.
Thank you. Thank you, Helena, for the talk. And you actually answered lots of questions that I prepared in my mind. But I would like you to elaborate on the idea of the negative feelings. You talked about the possibility and the space, like allowing space for mistakes and commitment against the practice of self-policing. And I think this is something very valuable to reflect on, especially as we talk about socially engaged art and participatory practices, when negative and conflictual feelings tend to be mediated or not talked through. And so on the one side, I would ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that. And another related question might be how to engage with negative conflict without adding further burden to the people who are involved in the projects.
Ooh. Yes, these are probably some of the things.
The major conundrum.
A really conundrum. You know, so we'll just sort of use like the reading group as my sort of curatorial practice at the moment, or my pedagogic practice, and how that's happened. I mean, because, you know, right now, feminism is becoming very fractured, as a lot of the kind of limitations and prejudices of feminists from the past are being kind of confronted, you know, be it white dominance, cis dominance, you know, ableism, and it can be quite painful. And I am a white, cis, able-bodied woman. So, you know, you know, if I wanted to, I could feel like I could really inhabit the position of somebody who's, you know, on the side of the oppressors, because I do, you know, represent a certain amount of privilege and so forth. So I think that's where, in situations where these issues erupt, you know, obviously, I mean, I agree with a lot of the critiques. We can see the feminist movement as a movement in process. you know, any movement is going to have its shortcomings and its particular investments, and it's just not going to notice other things, or it's going to be overly concerned with its own kind of subject position. So you just have to kind of accept those critiques, those resentments as almost inevitable, hold space for them, but hope that the people who are expressing, you know, frustration and anger will come back and still share space with you. That's kind of what it's all about. You know, I think what Alex Martinis Row was saying was, you know, stay with it, stay with the problem. Don't abandon ship because it feels awkward. Because of course, you know, we're just dealing with very real inequities and histories that can't be denied. The thing about who does the work, that's also really hard to solve. And you know, Sarah Ahmed is someone that I think about a lot in respect to this. You know, when she writes about doing work as a diversity officer, writing reports on all the problems of racism within the university, and then the university turns around and says, fantastic, great report, we're going to put this up on our website to show what a great job we're doing on tackling racism. But hang on a minute, you're not tackling it, you're just appropriating my labor. The fact is, it usually is the people who are most affected who do the work, because they're the ones who get it, and they're the ones who need to do the work. It's not fair, but that's the argument that Barbara Munoz Rodriguez makes in her book on care, that if you want to learn about care, you look at the communities that haven't been cared for. You know, you look at communities of color, you look at you know, communities of HIV positive you know, members. You look at sex workers, they're the ones who've done the work. They've built the collective care structures, they've fought for change, because of course the mainstream aren't, and those in power have no vested interest in challenging their power positions. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I would just say this, I'm really struggling with this. We did do a few sessions around whiteness in the reading group, and I would say, you know, obviously I really enjoyed this reading group, but they were really excruciating. I found them really difficult, and kind of thinking through whiteness and realizing my just investments in it and how far it's got me was really awkward. And I can't say I enjoyed those sessions at all, but they felt necessary.
Thank you very much for bringing this up. And now there's another question from Noah.
Hi, hello, Helena. Thank you so much for your lecture. I was your long description of your experience in the gallery as a curator, acting out confidence and control, is really resonating with me. I feel I could relate. I have an experience, a background of with dancing, professional dancing, and now kind of like getting into more the hardcore academy. And I think I've experienced environments as more in more comfort and with less, and kind of like, yeah, I think what I wanted to ask about is if, from my experience, some environments were more comfortable, some less, and I wonder if this kind of I find environments more receptive, and I was thinking in a more to ask you if there's some kind of idea or thought of you behind the design of receptive environments, which is something that I'm very curious about. And I feel that you might, sorry, you're muted, or I didn't hear you.
Did you say receptive environments?
Receptive environments. I think well, I'm speaking from my very own experience of some environments who felt really hostile and some environments that were not, both in the dance sector, the professional dance sector, from auditions to workshops to whatever, and both in the academy, being in my role of very early stage researcher in a language that is not my mother tongue. So, for example, like if there is kind of like a thought maybe that you have behind the design of environments that can be more receptive.
Gosh, yes, that's great. That's a really good question. I suppose one of the things that I find working in this reading group is this phrase, the practice of doing, which comes from the Milan Women's Bookshop again, and the idea that we kind of we become to rely on each other just through working together, and it is sort of volunteer labor. It could be criticized for being perhaps a form of exploited labor, but it's not really labor. It's what we enjoy doing together. So just supporting each other to make different activities happen and distributing the work in a kind of each according to their ability, each according to their need sort of way, and feeling that you're part of a commitment. I think this thing of an ongoing commitment is really important to why we have continued meeting for 6 years, and certain people kind of in and out of the group, but still there for 6 years. It's probably not directly applicable, but I would say that some of the aspects of the domestic realm being brought into larger group meetings, I have found them, just from experience, I've found that can really help. So to be honest, I've really stopped liking meeting in art galleries. I just find them really cold. I mean, sometimes physically, but also just really formal. And because there's a lot of also just security, and people have to leave at a certain time because they're being paid, even though we do continue, or we will be going back into art galleries because that's our sort of base, and they can be quite hospitable in that way. Just being able to build on the comfortable feelings that we have when we're in the homes of friends, and do that, but with people who aren't your friends, or people who are coming to something like a reading group. So be it, taking time to cook, or having a comfortable space. It maybe sounds a bit naff, but I also try to take seriously anything that's been dismissed as just like the feminine realm. I think there's so much within the feminine realm, not just the female, but the coded feminine realm, that is actually, there's a hell of a lot of work and knowledge and expertise that's been invested in the feminine realm of domesticity and hosting that we should value. Another thing is, yes, the sort of activities that can connect you with strangers. So like the reading aloud. I used to go to something called the reading walking group, where you would be put into pairs and you would discuss a text you'd read beforehand, and then you would gather in a park and usually end up in the pub. And that was great because, again, you had a kind of mediating. You had the mediation of the reading, but then you also had the experience of walking with someone. So it was kind of combining the bodily with the mental. Obviously, the brain is embodied as well, but you know what I mean. I'm just saying, I mean, there's nothing like particularly groundbreaking about these observations, but yeah, I'll just throw those out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I pass on to Alexei, and his question will be the last because we still have around 5 minutes. I just want to say that Cecilia, who you mentioned today, was in the room and she wanted to say something, but she had to run just right after, so she couldn't wait until her turn. So I'm just gonna maybe take courage and pass her regards to everyone on her behalf.
And you're working with Maria, is that right?
Hmm?
Are you working with her?
Yeah, I work with her at Ten Stockholm at the moment. Yeah. Okay, Alexei, here's your turn. Please go ahead.
I'm waiting for a really, really mean question.
Okay. Yes, I was actually. I gradually, yes. I thought I have only moderate questions, and in the end, I realized I have maybe one mean question that I could ask you. That's why I raised my hand. But no, I just wanted to to build on this incident with technical interruption when we mentioned exactly Goldsmith's strike, and it was frozen. You was immediately frozen after that, as if there was those sort of disruptive action of strike somehow affects technological system. And I mean, just to say that I have a lot of friends in Goldsmith, and I was spoken there for several occasions, and about my solidarity with which is happening there now, and probably tomorrow there will be UCU rally in London. Just trying to drop maybe some of my academic duties to attend this one. So, so my question was that, as you mentioned this strike, I was also wanted to say that I really in agreement with your picture of satirical picture of art world you presented in the first part of your lecture as a sort of kind of not just exploiting. I can relate to this. I mean, not just being female curator, but in general knowing through some art connections and friends and etc. So, but I thought this is really a kind of good picture to start to build some kind of artistic critical reflections. For example, how this neoliberalization of art institutions somehow destroys what actually art world was important for many of us, because it inherits these legacies of avant-garde, neo-avant-garde, this sort of spontaneity kind of values of creative thinking, not instrumental thinking, which is somehow leads to, as in academia, we are constantly hear this horrible phraseology of like leading to fighting or to something else. So this is horrible. What happens actually? It's real disaster. I mean, so that's why I'm just trying to raise the center this sort of these things you are really tackling, because when you, for example, I observed the art world in different national contexts for a number of years, and I know, for example, I noticed that recently the curators, they openly talk about their findings they're receiving, and even saying the numbers of funds they're getting, which was unthinkable maybe 15 years or 20 years ago. This sort of cynicism level, and also while being also part of the same social engaged art or critical art or whatever. So this is like, a little bit like, these sci-fi movies about Terminators who looks like human being, but then you stretch a little bit the surface and then you see this sort of just these cables or some kind of robotic parts of human beings. So this sort of new kind of subjectivity actually emerges, which somehow has this kind of human surface and this sort of metallic kind of parts inside, which is very often I can observe not just curators but artists as well in their way how they talk, how they try to manage these sort of human things, but at the same time framing them into this sort of instrumental way of kind of neoliberal didactics, which we are all taught in our academic or artistic institutions. So I mean, so this is a kind of double personality which emerges, which somehow torn between this legacy of art, which we all appreciate, and these sort of new neoliberal demands, which create this sort of conflict between these two sides. So Mike, as returning to my main question, I thought that maybe you mentioned, of course, this Foucauldian aspect of care of the self, and Foucault also was, I think, very much critical of this kind of hypocrisy because his address to ancient practices of self is also based on this relation between self and practices, and you should not diverge, for example, behaving in one way, but aiming to completely different ways. So this is also a kind of implicit critique of hypocrisy, which is now so kind of so widespread in this institution. So I think it's in general, and you also stress that of course you are not following strictly this Foucauldian approach to self-empowerment, autonomy, etc., but you also think about this solidarity, etc. But I was just thinking in relation to Goldsmith's strike. What do you think about the idea of art strike today? What does it has any kind of political or potential? Because it was a hot kind of topic since the 70s, maybe. But what do you think today? Because a friend of mine, Stuart Martin, he recently wrote a long piece at the journal called Mute about the whole history of art strike. What do you think about the art strikes today? It's a sudden question, but provoked by your mentioning Goldsmith.
Yeah, I don't exactly know what art strike is. I did read this good essay, and I will mangle his name, Kuba Schroeder,
yeah,
Polish writer, and I think very politically active. Or it was called something refusals, and he's talking a lot about art strikes. And I think the argument that he made that I really agreed with was that these are not withdrawals to do nothing. They're withdrawals to do things otherwise. They're taking up space differently. So yes, there may be no art being made. There may be no, the galleries may be occupied, the museums will be occupied, or the studios may be empty. But that's not just to kind of hang out and drink cosmopolitans. It's to put that energy and that creativity, which has been so instrumentalized, to say we refuse to continue feeding the beast, but we don't want to stop being creative, active, collective, but we're just going to perform otherwise in these institutions. So it's got to me, it evokes like the Occupy movement or something like that, of like.
But definitely politically, we are outside of that previous Occupy moment, of course. Yeah, but I mean, academically, these universities are quite boiling now. I mean, academic strikes are quite relevant.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening at Goldsmiths, in a way, it's more like carnivalesque at the moment on the pickets. That's the vibe. It's more to say, I think it's to remind ourselves of the vitality that we have, and that we do actually still want these institutions, and we care about them, and we kind of love them, despite the fact that they're being driven into the ground and developed along really horrible business models that just aren't even working. Goldsmiths has just spent £2 million on KPMG, these like management consultants that are, deeply embroiled in the financial crisis. It's just literally not working. But the kind of flourishing of creativity, of
again, instrumentalized in their kind of this proposal of evolving of Goldsmith or whatever, written the same creative language, which was brand name for
innovation. Yeah, just find some of the same language. Absolutely. Is there.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, this is really a current topic, and maybe we can continue discussing this in the informal situation of this platform called Wonder. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
I will just quickly announce the next lecture that will be on the 13th of January at the same time, so 6:30 German time, and it will be held by the Berlin-based independent curator Gidi Kajewski, who will introduce her practice and discuss the intersection of art, architecture, and the politics of urban society. And on that note, I would like to thank you all again, and also thank you, Helena, of the University of Wolverhampton, who's hosting the event, for taking care of all the technicalities, and Helena Reckitt for the presentation, and all of you for this very nice conversation we had with this great atmosphere. So thank you all.
Good.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Goodbye.